Writer and political commentator Adam Schwarz, thank you so much for coming. And down the line, Talk TV's international editor Isabel Oakes. Why don't we start with you, Adam? Obviously, you're watching, you're listening, and Rishi Sunak has I think, veered from apologetic, borderline tearful to exceptionally gung-ho and very, I suppose, keen to defend his action in Take Out to Help Out. Absolutely not going with the idea that, it was a bad thing and people died as a result and it never should have happened. Far from it.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's a perfect representation of it. And I think it's partly due to the fact that Rishi Sunak is, of course, a current Prime Minister rather than a former Prime Minister. So he's not rather just trying to defend his legacy, but actually trying to potentially defend his current administration. I think people will naturally try to contrast his performance with Boris Johnson's performance last week. I think Rishi Sunak was much more polished and refined than Boris Johnson, perhaps not too surprisingly for a lot of people. But I do still think there were sort of credibility gaps on certain issues. I mean, even if you take the apology, which he opened with, he apologised in very sort of ambiguous and broad terms. But actually, it's very difficult to accept an apology when he's not really saying what he's sort of sorry for, essentially. Again, if you look at the issue over WhatsApps, he said, they was asked why are there no WhatsApps available from the key decisions made in COVID, and he said, well, I changed phones so many times that it wasn't possible. This is the guy who claims to be leading Britain into a tech revolution. So I think there were some issues there, but I think fundamentally, this session was really for Rishi Sunak about the fundamental tensions that you had between trying to save lives with lockdown and also the economic damage that you had with that came with that. I think, unfortunately, that's sort of the way that it's been presented, and I think really that's the kind of fundamental issues. And of course, your colleague mentioned "eat out to help out," and I think that the most important line for me from today was the fact that Sunak said that his main priority was trying to protect millions of jobs of what he called particularly vulnerable people. Now, they weren't vulnerable because they were, vulnerable because of health reasons, but actually vulnerable because of the sectors. And I think really that kind of summarises the way that Rishi Sunak approaches this issue. But also I think fundamentally, Sunak is trying to stay on brand that he's the man about the economy, he's about competence, he's about jobs. So I think it's really important to look at his performance from that perspective as well.
A chocolate teapot, a waste of time, incredibly expensive, enormously long drawn out, but worth it or not worth it?
This country lost almost 250,000 people to COVID in the last few years, and we're also in hundreds of billions of pounds more debt than we were previously. I think it's absolutely fundamentally important that we have an inquiry that independently and thoroughly looks at all of the different issues, so that inevitably, unfortunately, when we have another pandemic, we'll be much more in a much better position to deal with both the health crisis but also the economic crisis that comes from it as well.
Thank you very much indeed.